Now I'd like to introduce someone whose commitment has benefited both our industry and this association. He did so by agreeing to be your Eastern Region Vice President. Please welcome United Electric Supply's President and CEO, George Vorwick. George, I also want to take a moment to congratulate you on United Electric's 50-year anniversary.
That is a big hand. It was late September in 1985, and Hurricane Gloria slammed into the coast of Long Island. The very next day, me and 3 of my friends took off in my 26-foot sailboat for a week's vacation. We left Raritan Bay, we rounded Sandy Hook, we started heading toward Cape May. The sky was dark and gray. The wind was blowing steady at about 35 knots, and the seas rolled in at about 7 feet. How I know that it was 7 feet is because when I stood up on my boat and we were in the bottom of a trough between 2 waves, I could see nothing but 2 walls of water on either side. Late in the afternoon, we're about 10 miles off the coast, and our mainsail broke, and the boat started drifting in the wind. I got out of the cockpit, climbed up on deck, no life jacket, no harness. I crawled up to the mast, and I took 2 hands and I started grabbing the sail to bring it down. A wave came, tilted the boat backwards. I started sliding off the boat. I turned and looked at the water, and in that moment, I knew that if I went in the water, my friends, by the time they were able to get the sail down and fixed, they were unlikely to be able to find me. At that moment, another wave came and sent me sliding right back toward the mast. I grabbed it with both arms. Did you ever hear that saying, "I'd rather be lucky than good"? I don't think I've ever been so lucky in my life. Let me tell you how that story ended. We got the mainsail fixed. We kept heading south. Sometime before dawn, a friend of mine was at the wheel. He fell asleep. The boat slammed into a sandbar, and we started sinking. I gave the call to blow up the life raft. I got on the VHF. I called the Coast Guard. They sent a cutter, but we were too far into the surf. They couldn't get to us. The sun came up, and the wind stopped blowing, and it was all calm. And then they sent a helicopter out, and the helicopter lowered down next to our boat. The prop wash caused a few waves, and it bumped us into a channel, and they towed us in. The boat was pretty beat up. So we rented a couple of cheap hotel rooms while we waited for the boat to get fixed. And because we were young and we were on vacation, we found out that Otis Day and the Nights was playing at a bar nearby, and we did what any group of young men would do. We ripped the sheets off our beds, we dressed up in togas, and we went to go see Otis Day. And yes, I'm a little bit embarrassed to say, when we walked in, I did yell out, "Otis, my man." 15 years later, I get a call from another friend. He asked me to fly to Port St. Lucie to help him bring his 48-foot schooner back up to New York Harbor. This trip could take about a week to 10 days. During that time, I spent a lot of time learning the craft of sailing. I took a bunch of educational classes on safety. I read books on navigation. I sailed a season on a winning racing team. I flew to Florida to meet the crew. The captain was a friend of mine, his wife, their 20-year-old son, another friend, and an Australian captain who could switch as easily from charming to mean like you and I would flip a light switch. We took off early in the morning. The sun was out. It was beautiful. We're about 150 miles off the coast, and it was about midnight, and it ended my watch, and I went down below to get some sleep. My next watch was 4 a.m. I was in my bunk, dead asleep, and all of a sudden I start to wake, and my first sensation was of the boat pounding through the waves and speed. My next sensation, hearing, came in, and I heard the wind blowing hard through the rigging. And then I heard the captain say, "All hands on deck." I popped out of my bunk, I looked across the cabin, and sitting there was my watchmate holding his head, and there was blood all over his hand. I grabbed the flashlight, I looked at his head. He had a scar, probably could use a couple of stitches, but he was going to be all right. He was a little shocky, so I grabbed a paper towel, put it on his head, and said, "Here, hold this." I put my foul weather gear on, put a harness on, started heading toward the cockpit. And on the bunk, just before I left to go out of the cockpit, was the owner's wife, and she was paralyzed by fear. She wasn't going anywhere. I got up in the cockpit. The captain was holding white-knuckled onto the steering wheel. We found out later that the wind in that squall had blown, the top speed that night was 58 miles an hour. The boat was just out of control. The sails were up. We had to get them down. I sit in the cockpit. I jack in. The owner's son's to my left. The Australian captain's across from me. And the captain of the boat is holding on the wheel to my right. We start yelling at each other because the wind's blowing so hard. Yelling is the only way you could hear each other about how we're going to plan to walk up on deck and pull that mainsail down. At that moment, a rogue wave came and hit me in the back. I'm sure you've all had that sensation if you've been in the ocean and you've turned your back to a wave and it's hit you, kind of startles you. That wave sent me across the cockpit. The Australian captain didn't have a harness on. It slammed me into him. I wrapped my arms around him. We were both going overboard. And my harness tugged tight and kept us on board. That saying, "I'd rather be lucky than good"? Not me. I'd rather be prepared. Well, maybe a little lucky too. It may be no surprise with an experience like that lifelong learning is a passion of mine. Another reason why it's a passion. I started in this business, I was 16. I was handed a broom and told to go sweep the parking lot. Lifelong learner in NAED. NAED has been a big part of my career and how I've grown. It's a big part of United's success. The education sessions that we have here at our Eastern Region Conference have been extremely valuable. A few years ago, we attended a seminar on value proposition. It started a year-long conversation at our company about how we articulate our value proposition, which turned into a refresh of our brand. The relationships and advice that I've received over the years through our networking sessions have been also equally as helpful. One night I was in a bar and a friend of mine, now retired, used to work for Thomas & Betts, pulled me aside and he said, "George, you got to learn when it's time to stop talking about business." Something I struggle with today. When I was very frustrated about all the services we were giving away and bound and determined to figure out a way for charge for some of these unique services, again in a bar at an Eastern Region Conference, I ran into Brian Peters and Doug Borchers, expressed that frustration, and it turns out that Doug was doing some work on selling services, and we put a little team together, and it's been very helpful to us. We also utilize at the office the tools available from NAED to help us prepare the next generation of leaders at our company, EPIC and the LEAD conference. So how did that schooner story end? Well, it's never really ended. A high-pressure system built in, the wind blew strong in the right direction, and we made it back to New York Harbor in 7 days. The rest of the trip was fairly uneventful. I took the train back to Annapolis. I went back to my wife and my 3 daughters, and we've sailed thousands of miles since then. And our adventure continues. As I wrap up, I'd like to take a moment to acknowledge the group that's serving the Eastern Region Council. These people continue to give generously of their time. I'd like to personally thank each of you for the difference you're making in our industry. I'm going to read these people off, so please hold your applause to the end. Peter Belwar, Colonial Electric Supply. Mark Borgini, City Electric. John Kane, Wiseway. Mike Carr, Capital Tri-State. Phil Seminara, F&M Electric. Andrew Essie, City Electric. John Hardy, Sonopar. Bradley Jarvis, Electrical Supply. Brian Carl, Lakeland Electric. And Nate Labor, Green Mountain Electric Supply. My buddy Mark Valvisi, Penn Supply, Eastern Penn Supply. Scott Monroe, Rexel, Energy Solutions. Scott O'Day, Controller, Service and Sales. And Neil Schaefer, Dickman Supply. Julie Seferis, Horizon Solutions. And Augie Sedora, Swift Electric Supply. Amanda Witham, Crescent Electric Supply. William Resch, Mid-Island Electric Supply, a division of Turtle & Hughes. And lastly, I'd like to recognize Jeff Van Zant, Vice President of Operations, Tri-State Supply. He will be our next Eastern Region Vice President. Let's give them all a round of applause. I would also like to announce that Andrew Essie has been elected our Vice President-elect, coming in after Jeff. I sincerely appreciate, Andrew, your willingness to step up and serve. Thank you. And Glenn, I want to thank you very much. It's been a pleasure getting to know you. Your vision and your enthusiasm is catching. I appreciate everything you've done for all of us.